From UFOs to psychic powers and government conspiracies, history is riddled with unexplained events. You can turn back now or learn the stuff they don't want you to know. Look, one thing that I think is interesting by way of comparison for people first hearing about this in 2021 is that when you think of Butler from the perspective of his contemporaries and from this time in his life, think of Captain America. Think of like an older retired Captain America who still has a lot of vim and vigor and fight in him. He's
still a hero.
Yeah. He is considered, of course, an infernal force to the people of Haiti, but to the people back home, he is a war hero. And this is something that they sought, no pun intended, the banking forces sought to capitalize upon. That's two levels of no pun intended, but here we are. So one thing that really stands out to me in these conversations when we've been talking, and something you address in Gangsters of Capitalism, is the weird opinion of fascism, right? Nowadays, most people in the US can agree, whatever their political ideology, that fascism, however nebulously defined, is a bad thing. That is no longer a hot take, right? But this wasn't always the case. And, you can see this in the statements and beliefs of business tycoons of Butler's day. Could you tell us a little bit more about what they saw fascism as and why they preferred it to, what they saw as the dangerous, vast red shadow of communism or socialism?
Exactly. Yeah. So, Mussolini in particular was really, really popular. Throughout the 1920s and the early 1930s, at least, and certainly up to this point that we're talking about in 1934. Not with everybody, but much more popular than I think than people maybe in 2022 fully appreciate. He was seen by a lot of people as sort of this strong modernizer. And Mussolini in particular had come out of the socialist movement in Italy, but rejected it ultimately, and essentially came up with fascism as a way of sort of doing a socialist style reorganization of society, by which I mean, breaking away from the liberal order. And breaking away from sort of, 19th century style capitalism, but he did it by rejecting class analysis, or by using a class analysis that basically said that like rich people could keep their money and rich people really liked that. Like that was a really exciting thing for them, because again, socialism, it was a very attractive idea to a lot of people, still is, because it promises a better way of life for more people. And so Mussolini is basically saying like, we'll do that, but instead of, using sort of class analysis and class politics and labor unions to improve people's lives, we'll just like have rich people stay rich and then break the heads of anybody who like we feel like. It doesn't actually make any sense. Like it's a completely incoherent like way of thinking about the world. But if you are, say, Thomas Lamont, who was the head of J.P. Morgan and Company at this moment, he called himself something of a missionary for Mussolini. He was friends with him. The Johnson-Reed Act. So the Johnson-Reed, extremely racist immigration act that kind of shut off immigration, from Europe and this lasted for decades, basically until the 1960s. One of the sponsors of that, Reed, said, on the Senate floor that, like, he thought that, the United States could use a Mussolini. The American Legion, they invited Mussolini to speak. They would open their conventions with, like, greetings from a fellow, honorable, World War veteran, Signor Mussolini. There's a song from the musical Anything Goes. You're the top. And one of the versions of that, so it's like, you're the top, you're the Mona Lisa, like, you're like all the best things that are like in the 20s. And one of the lines was like, you're Mussolini, right?
Wow.
People, like, it was dumb. Like, it was really stupid. And it became very clear, I think, shortly after this. So one of the things that Mussolini did that discredited him quickly was invading Ethiopia. It was a horrendous invasion. They used mustard gas and fighter planes, and it was sort of a preview of the Second World War. And then, obviously, everything that happened after that, the Spanish Civil War, World War II, like, fascism is pretty much discredited at this point. But to people who were particularly, and it still does, it appeals to a certain kind of mind. People who are just sort of like, the best thing to do is to crack the skulls of my enemies. The best thing to do is to have, like, one strong leader who speaks with authority and tells me what to believe. That's appealing to some people. And again, in 1934, if you were a very wealthy businessman, and you see your fellow rich guy, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, come into office and say, he takes the dollar off the gold standard. He, declares an immediate bank holiday. He's trying to regulate the banks. He's trying to sort of regulate the excesses of capitalism that led to the crash that creates the Great Depression. You're like, oh God, this sounds so much like socialism, because, just to some extent it was. I mean, he was taking some of the good ideas that socialism had and using them really to save capitalism. But, you could, I'm not saying I agree with them, but I'm just sort of trying to put you and the people listening in the mindset of, like, what would make somebody think this. And to a certain extent, we're seeing this again today. I mean, liberal democracy is again being discredited in various ways. It doesn't sort of matter where you are on the political spectrum. Like, liberal has kind of become a dirty word, even if you're on the left. And there is sort of a, as Franklin Roosevelt noted in his day, kind of a hunger among some people for a strong man. And it's almost always a man who, will, destroy your enemies and, tell you who to hate and then give you permission. And this is really the big thing. It will give you permission to just, like, live out your just, most extreme, Freudian psychosexual fantasies in destroying these people. And that just as it did back then, it is now, as memory of the horrors of fascism, in the 1930s and the 1940s, as everybody who remembers those things is, slowly, going away, rip Betty White, and her generation. It's that is again starting to appeal to people, and and that's in a lot of ways what makes this such an urgent conversation to have.
Can we go back to the Spanish-American War for a moment? Because I think Smedley Butler had that moment where all of a sudden there's something worth fighting for when the USS Maine explosion tragedy occurs, and I think it's 260 individuals lost their lives during that, and it was blamed pretty squarely on the Spanish forces, and through the things that were written. And is it the New York Journal? I forget what's the that's the one, New York Journal at the time.
It was the Herald was, I think, the Herald was the Hearst paper and the Journal was the Pulitzer paper.
So
so
there's
getting those confused. Yeah.
But there's some,
But yes.
there are articles written that basically identify an enemy and something worth fighting for, and that's when around the time when Smedley joins up, correct?
It's exactly what it is. It's I mean, it's, to put it in modern terms, it was basically a 9/11 of its day. And I don't say that lightly. And maybe I should define a couple of terms in there just so people don't get the wrong impression. But what I mean basically is that it was a big spectacular event that was immediately interpreted as a national tragedy, as an attack on the nation, that called out for revenge. And then was used as one pretext. It wasn't actually the only pretext, but it was one, and it was a major pretext for the U.S. invasion of Cuba. So back to the weeds. So Cuba's an island in the Caribbean. So Cuba was a colony of Spain, and it had been basically since Christopher Columbus dropped anchor in Guantanamo Bay in 1494. And Cubans had been fighting for their independence for about 30 years at that point. And they were very close to winning it. A new war had started in 1895, and it to a certain extent, it had the best thing you could say for the Spanish was that they had battled to a stalemate at that point. But the Spanish were committing horrible atrocities against the Cuban people. They invented a thing called reconcentración, which is translated into English as concentration camps. So they invented concentration camps in Cuba. And they're starving the population. They're killing women and children. It's a nightmare. And the battleship Maine, one of America's first two steel battleships, goes to Havana Harbor on a mission to basically protect American interests in Cuba during this war. And it explodes. And nobody knows why it explodes. And actually, contrary to popular belief, the U.S. government never actually makes a statement that the Spanish were responsible for the explosion. They also don't make a statement disclaiming the rumors that the Spanish were responsible for the explosion. They kind of use that frenzy, which, as you know, was really created. It was created by the sort of the Cuban Exile War Caucus, but also by the newspapers, especially Joseph Pulitzer, for whom the Pulitzer Prizes are named, by the way, and William Randolph Hearst, and so Smedley Butler is a 16-year-old. He's in high school on the main line of Philadelphia in a town called Westchester. And he hears about this, and he's spurred into action, like a lot of people. And he sees himself as avenging the deaths of the sailors and the Marines who died on the Maine. And he also sees himself as, as he puts it, shouldering a rifle to free little Cuba. So he gets into that war. He's doing it sort of for anti-imperialist, democratic. They're filtered through this sort of racist, paternalist idea that a 16-year-old white kid from the suburbs of Philly is needed to help the Cubans fight a war that they've already been fighting for 30 years. It doesn't actually make any sense when you think about it, but it made sense to him. And so he actually lies about his age and joins the Marines. What I wanted to say about, the comparisons to 9/11 is that the Maine is often sort of, talked about, especially online, as being the prime example of a false flag attack. And 9/11 is in the darker corners of the internet, sometimes, sort of talked about in the same way. I've seen no evidence that, I mean, the Bush administration certainly used 9/11 for their own purposes. And it ended up being crassly convenient for them. But I don't see any evidence that they actually planned it or did it. And by the same token, there's no evidence that the McKinley administration like purposefully blew up their own ship in order to justify going to war. They probably would have been able to justify going to war anyway. There was already sort of a beating drums, in that direction in Congress, which at that point had the power to declare war. Still does technically, but doesn't really use it. And it just seems like it was a design flaw. Basically, like the boiler was next to the munitions store, and it was just a dumb design for a ship.